August 23rd, 1847. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The smell reaches the constables before the door is forced open. A cloying sweetness rises from the locked cellar beneath the Beaumont plantation house, thick enough to turn the stomach. When the iron door finally gives way, even hardened lawmen stagger back into the yard to vomit. Inside are chains, bloodstains on silk cushions, and a leather-bound journal, its handwriting precise, elegant, and unrelentingly detailed, so meticulous in its depravity that a judge would later order it sealed for more than a century. The wife of one of Louisiana's most powerful political families had been living a double life, and when her secret surfaced, they threatened to bring down an empire built on cotton, influence, and carefully maintained illusion. But the truth, what actually happened that summer, was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the Beaumont scandal that nearly shattered Louisiana's political establishment, make sure to subscribe to Hypnotic Histories, ring the notification bell, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of history seekers around the world. Louisiana in 1847 stood at a crossroads. The Mexican-American War raged in the Southwest, drawing young men from plantations into military service. New Orleans ranked among the wealthiest cities in the nation, its prosperity built almost entirely on enslaved labor and the cotton that flowed through its ports like white gold. Political power rested with a narrow elite, families whose names appeared on bank charters, legislative rosters, and deeds to thousands of acres. Among them stood the Beaumont family. Governor Philippe Beaumont had served 2 terms and wielded influence well beyond his official authority. His plantation, Belle Ombre, stretched across 3,000 acres along the Mississippi River, its column mansion visible to passing steamboats. More than 200 enslaved workers labored there, generating wealth that impressed even other planters. Philippe himself embodied Southern authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, a former militia officer, bank director, and confidant of men who would later shape the Confederacy. Yet his greatest pride was not his land or his power. It was his wife, Marguerite Beaumont, just 23 years old in 1847, possessed a beauty that inspired poetry from men who had never written a line. The daughter of a French Creole shipping magnate, educated in Paris, fluent in French, accomplished in music and conversation, she represented the ideal antebellum Southern woman, graceful, refined, and delicately removed from the brutal machinery that sustained her lifestyle. She presided over Belle Ombre's social life with effortless charm. Her dinners drew guests from Charleston and Atlanta. She played Chopin on an imported piano. Church leaders praised her charity. Society columnists celebrated her taste. No one suspected what lay behind her carefully composed smile. Belle Ombre operated like most great plantations. Philippe spent long periods in Baton Rouge or New Orleans managing political and financial affairs. Marguerite remained at the estate, nominally overseeing domestic operations but delegating daily control to the house slaves and the overseer, Duncan McCready. Among the enslaved laborers was a man named Samuel. Plantation records listed him simply as Samuel, age 24, field hand. Born on a smaller property near Natchez, he had been sold to the Beaumonts in 1844. Unusually tall, powerfully built, and possessing an intelligence that unsettled overseers, Samuel carried a dangerous secret. He could read. Literacy among enslaved people was illegal in Louisiana, but he had learned in childhood from a sympathetic tutor. In the spring of 1846, Samuel suffered a severe injury when a plow blade gashed his leg. Infection followed. For weeks, he lay feverish in the slave quarters. It was then that Marguerite Beaumont noticed him. According to later testimony, she visited the quarters herself, highly unusual for a woman of her rank, and insisted on tending his wound personally. She brought medicines, clean bandages, even books to occupy him during recovery. The attention unsettled other enslaved workers, but none dared question the mistress's behavior. By summer, Samuel returned to the fields. But something at Belle Ombre had shifted. Marguerite began taking long walks alone, dismissing her customary chaperones. She requested that specific enslaved workers attend her, always including Samuel. Overseer McCready grew uneasy and mentioned irregularities to Governor Beaumont during a brief visit home. Philippe dismissed the concern. His wife, he said, was compassionate. Christian charity was one of her virtues. McCready should focus on cotton yields. What no one knew was that Marguerite had begun keeping a journal, and what it contained would destroy everything. The first warning sign came in November 1846. Delia, Marguerite's personal maid, reported that her mistress had been disappearing for hours. When she returned, the hems of her dresses were stained, not with garden soil, but red clay from the far edge of the property where abandoned tobacco barns stood. McCready inspected the barns. One had been recently repaired and fitted with a new lock. The carpenter explained that Mrs. Bowmont had ordered the work herself, intending to use the structure as a private studio. Eccentric, perhaps, but not yet alarming. The second incident occurred in January 1847, when Philippe returned home unexpectedly. Marguerite described a day spent reviewing accounts and visiting the slave quarters, but Philippe's valet, Jacob, later contradicted her story. He had seen her carrying a basket of food toward the old barns and had watched her disappear for hours. Confronted, Marguerite laughed it away. She had been painting, she said. The food was for herself. She was embarrassed to show unfinished work. Philippe accepted the explanation. The third incident shattered McCready's remaining doubts. In March, an older field hand named Moses reported hearing voices inside the abandoned barn, a man and a woman speaking softly. He recognized Marguerite's French-accented voice. He also recognized Samuel's. McCready began watching the barn. Days later, he saw Marguerite unlock the door and enter. 20 minutes after that, Samuel approached from another direction and slipped inside. They remained there for hours. McCready understood immediately what this meant. If true, it was not merely scandal. It was a social catastrophe. He wrote Governor Beaumont a carefully worded letter urging his immediate return. But events moved faster than the courier. On April 2nd, 1847, a house slave named Ruth discovered Marguerite's journal hidden behind a dresser. Though barely literate, she recognized words: love, Samuel, secret. Delia, read further. The journal documented an explicit, ongoing affair. Declarations of love. Plans to escape north together. A future impossible under Southern law. Terrified, the women brought the journal to McCready, who sealed it and summoned the governor. Philippe arrived at dawn on April 6th. He confronted Marguerite with the journal. She denied nothing for long. When denial failed, she defended the affair. She loved Samuel, she said. Their love transcended race, law, and ownership. Philippe struck her. He ordered Samuel confined and sentenced him to be sold away and publicly whipped. Marguerite was to be committed to an asylum. Madness, he reasoned, was the only explanation. Before those orders could be carried out, Marguerite fled. She ran not for the gates, but for the tobacco barn. She still had the key. Inside, the barn had been transformed. Silk hangings, cushions, lamps, books, and iron chains bolted to the beams. Food, water, blankets, and poison. Samuel escaped his guards and ran to her. They barred the door. When Philippe arrived with armed men, Marguerite's voice answered from within. Calm, resolute, we will not be parted. At approximately 12:15 p.m., smoke began seeping from the walls. Marguerite had set the barn on fire. When the flames died, 2 bodies remained. Identification came only through a wedding ring and a slave's belt buckle. The journal survived, sealed inside a metal box. Its final words read, "They call this sin. They call us abominations. But I have known more humanity in Samuel's arms than in all the drawing rooms of my gilded life. If we are destroyed, let our story survive." Governor Beaumont moved quickly. His wife, he declared, had been insane. Samuel died attempting to save her. Records were sealed. Dissenting reports buried. Witnesses silenced. Enslaved families were sold off. The scandal vanished, officially, but copies of the journal survived. In secret, in whispers, in archives. And today, the Beaumont affair stands as a fracture in the facade of the antebellum South. Proof that the system of slavery required not just violence, but silence, because love itself threatened its foundations. The wound became infected, and for weeks Samuel lay in the slave quarters, burning with fever. It was during this long recovery that Marguerite Beaumont first took personal notice of him. According to later testimony, she began visiting the quarters herself, an act highly unusual for a woman of her social rank, and insisted on tending to his injury personally. She brought fresh bandages and medicines from the main house, even books to occupy him during his convalescence. The other enslaved workers found the attention unsettling, but they said nothing. One did not question the behavior of white people, least of all the mistress of the plantation. By summer, Samuel had recovered and returned to the fields. Yet something at Belle Ombre had shifted, a change so gradual that few noticed it at first. Marguerite began spending extended periods away from the main house. She took long walks alone across the property, dismissing the chaperones custom required. She began requesting that specific enslaved workers assist with various tasks, always ensuring that Samuel was among them. The overseer, Duncan McCready, grew concerned enough to mention these irregularities during one of Governor Philippe Beaumont's brief visits home. Philippe dismissed the worries with a casual wave of his hand. His wife, he explained, had always possessed an unusually compassionate nature toward the enslaved. It was one of her virtues, Christian charity. McCready was advised to concern himself with cotton yields and leave household matters to the women. What McCready did not know, what no one knew, was that Marguerite had begun keeping a journal. Its contents would eventually expose a truth so scandalous, so completely at odds with every social and legal norm of the antebellum South, that would permanently destroy her family's reputation. The first incident that raised serious alarm occurred in November 1846, though its significance would not be fully understood until much later. Delia, Marguerite's personal maid, approached McCready with a troubling observation. The mistress, she reported, had been disappearing for hours at a time, claiming to walk the gardens or visit the overseer's office. Yet when she returned, her fine dresses often bore dirt along the hems. Not the dark soil of the manicured gardens, but red clay from the far edges of the property, where the abandoned tobacco barn stood. McCready investigated the barns himself. The structures dated back decades, relics from before Belle Ombre had converted entirely to cotton. They now sat empty and decaying at the plantation's edge. Nothing appeared overtly amiss, though one detail caught his attention. A barn door had been recently repaired and fitted with a new lock, an odd expense for an abandoned building. When he questioned the carpenter, the explanation seemed harmless enough. Mrs. Beaumont, the man said, had commissioned the work herself. She intended to restore the barn as a private studio, a quiet place for painting or other artistic pursuits away from the bustle of the main house. She had even ordered curtains installed over the windows. McCready found behavior eccentric, but not alarming. Wealthy women often indulged in private hobbies. He filed the matter away and returned to managing the plantation. The second incident proved harder to dismiss. In January 1847, Philippe Beaumont returned home unexpectedly from Baton Rouge. That evening at dinner, he casually asked Marguerite how she had spent her day. She described a morning reviewing household accounts and an afternoon visiting several enslaved people in the quarters, her customary charitable work. Later that evening, Philippe's personal valet, a trusted house slave named Jacob, quietly pulled the governor aside. He had seen Mrs. Beaumont that afternoon, Jacob said, and she had not been anywhere near the quarters. Instead, he had observed her walking toward the old tobacco barns, carrying what appeared to be a basket of food. She had been gone for more than 3 hours. When Philippe confronted his wife, Marguerite laughed lightly. She had indeed gone to the barns, she said, her painting studio, and had lost track of time working on a canvas. The basket was her lunch. As for Jacob's timing, he must have been mistaken. Philippe accepted the explanation, though he found it curious that his wife had never mentioned taking up painting. When he asked to see her work, Marguerite demurred. The paintings were not ready. She was still learning. The governor let the matter drop. He had legislation to shepherd through committee and little patience for his wife's artistic experiments. The third incident occurred in March 1847, and finally convinced McCready that something deeply wrong was unfolding at Belle Ombre. A field hand named Moses approached him with visible hesitation. Moses was in his 50s and had worked the property for decades. He had never before brought a complaint to the overseer. 2 days earlier, Moses explained he had been repairing a fence near the tobacco barns when he heard voices inside one of the structures. Not the sound of work, but low conversation between a man and a woman. At first, he assumed it was a white mechanic. Then he recognized the woman's voice. Mrs. Beaumont's French accent was unmistakable. Moments later, he recognized a man's voice as well. It belonged to Samuel. Moses froze, uncertain what to do. After several minutes, he quietly withdrew, his fence work forgotten. He debated whether to report what he had heard, knowing the danger of making accusations involving white people, but the unease would not leave him. Why would the mistress of the plantation meet alone with a field slave in an abandoned barn? As McCready listened, the blood drained from his face. If the account was true, the implications were catastrophic. At best, it represented a shocking breach of social propriety. At worst, it suggested a crime so unthinkable that he could barely allow himself to name it. McCready decided to observe the barns himself. For 3 days, he found reasons to work nearby, keeping the structures in view from a discreet distance. On the 4th day, his fears were confirmed. Marguerite arrived at the barn shortly after midday, glanced around, and unlocked the door with a key drawn from beneath her shawl. She slipped inside. 20 minutes later, Samuel approached from a different direction, scanning his surroundings before entering the same door. McCready waited. An hour passed, then another. As the sun began to sink, Samuel emerged first, checked the area, and walked away. 15 minutes later, Marguerite exited, locked the door, and returned toward the main house. The overseer stood frozen. In 20 years of managing plantations, he had never faced a crisis like this. Reporting what he had seen meant accusing the governor's wife of the most forbidden act imaginable in Southern society, the mixing of races. The accusation alone could destroy reputations, including his own if he were wrong. Yet silence, if the truth later emerged, would mark him as complicit. McCready chose a middle course. He wrote a carefully worded letter to Governor Beaumont, noting only that irregularities in Mrs. Beaumont's daily activities warranted his immediate attention. The letter was sent by private courier marked urgent. Before Philippe could respond, the 4th and final incident occurred. On April 2nd, 1847, a house slave named Ruth made a discovery that would force the truth into the open. While cleaning Marguerite's chambers, she found a small leather journal that had slipped behind a dresser. Curiosity overcame caution. Ruth could not read well, but she recognized certain words: love, Samuel, secret, night. The handwriting was unmistakably the mistress's. Terrified, Ruth brought the journal to Delia, who could read more fluently. Together they read entries that left them shaking. The journal did not merely describe meetings. It detailed a passionate affair between Marguerite Beaumont and enslaved man Samuel, explicit encounters, declarations of love, and plans to escape north to states where such a union might be possible. The women understood the danger immediately. Possessing such knowledge could get them killed. Yet they also knew they could not keep silent. Delia brought the journal to McCready. He read only enough to confirm his worst fears before sealing it in his office safe. Another courier was dispatched to Philippe Beaumont, this time with a message that left no room for ambiguity. Return home immediately. A scandal of the gravest nature threatens your household. By mid-morning on April 6th, Samuel stood in the main hall of Bel Amber, facing a governor consumed by a fury colder than rage. Philippe Beaumont had just learned that his wife had betrayed him with an enslaved man. Witnesses later recalled that the confrontation lasted only minutes. There was no shouting, no theatrical outburst. Philippe listened, pale and rigid, and then pronounced sentence with terrifying calm. Samuel was to be sold immediately, off the plantation that very day, to the most distant buyer that could be found. Before his removal, he would be whipped publicly. 50 lashes, administered in the yard, meant as a warning to every enslaved person at Bel Amber. As for Marguerite, Philippe announced his intention to have the marriage annulled and his wife committed to an asylum for the insane. Only madness, he reasoned, could explain such behavior. None of those sentences would ever be carried out. Before the overseers could act, Marguerite did something that transformed a scandal into a tragedy. What happened next would be reconstructed painstakingly by investigators over following weeks, pieced together from witness testimony, physical evidence, and the meticulous journal entries Marguerite continued writing until the end. At approximately 10:30 a.m., while Philippe withdrew to his study to compose letters to his lawyer and to Marguerite's father, and while the overseer McCready supervised construction of a whipping post in the yard, Marguerite slipped away from the house. She told the enslaved woman assigned to watch her that she needed to use the privy, a request that could not be denied. Once outside, she did not run for the gates or the road. She knew she would never make it past the guards. Instead, she fled toward the tobacco barns, toward the place where she and Samuel had spent their stolen hours together. She still possessed the key. What Marguerite did during the frantic minutes that followed would be debated for years. The physical evidence suggested preparation, as though some part of her had always known discovery was inevitable. Inside the barn, investigators found the space transformed into something between a sanctuary and a cell. Silk hangings, likely taken from the main house over many months, draped the walls. There was furniture, a settee, cushions, a small table with oil lamps. Books lined makeshift shelves. And there were chains, iron shackles bolted to the structural beams, their purpose both unclear and deeply unsettling. Marguerite had also stored supplies: food, water, blankets, candles, and poison, a bottle of laudanum, an opium-based tincture commonly used as medicine, but lethal in sufficient quantities. At some point, Samuel broke free from his guards. Accounts differed as to how, whether through strength, deception, or the quiet sympathy of others, but he too ran for the tobacco barn. Perhaps Marguerite had managed to get word to him. Perhaps he simply knew where she would go. By the time Philippe and McCready realized both had escaped, Samuel had already reached the barn and barred the door from inside. Through the small windows, witnesses later reported hearing voices, pleading, crying, desperate conversation in both English and French. Philippe arrived with armed overseers and demanded the door be opened. He threatened to burn the structure down. He offered promises and threats in equal measure. The reply came in Marguerite's voice, steady despite the strain beneath it. "We will not be parted. Not by you, not by this world's cruel laws. If we cannot live as we wish, we will die as we choose." The standoff lasted nearly an hour. Philippe attempted negotiation, offering clemency for Samuel if they surrendered. He promised Marguerite she would not be committed to an asylum. The lies were transparent to everyone present, including those who spoke them. At approximately 12:15 p.m., smoke began seeping through the gaps in the barn's walls. Marguerite had set the structure on fire from the inside. What followed descended into chaos. Men rushed with buckets. Enslaved people screamed in horror as they watched from the yard. Philippe himself tried to break down the door before the heat and flames drove him back. The confusion was so complete that coherent accounts became nearly impossible. When the fire finally burned itself out, leaving only charred beams and ash, investigators sifted through the ruins. They found 2 bodies, burned beyond recognition. Identification came only through surviving artifacts: Marguerite's wedding ring and a belt buckle consistent with those issued to field slaves. They also found the journal, miraculously preserved inside a metal box. It had been placed deliberately, carefully, as though Marguerite intended it to survive even if she did not. The final entry, written only hours before the confrontation, read, "They call this in. They call us abominations. But I have felt more humanity in Samuel's arms than in all the drawing rooms and ballrooms of my gilded life. If we are destroyed for this, let our story survive. Let someone someday understand that love itself recognizes no master." The discovery sent shockwaves through Louisiana's political establishment. Governor Bowmont immediately seized control of the narrative. He declared that his wife had been driven mad by a mysterious illness and had taken her own life in a moment of insanity. Samuel, he claimed, had merely been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of fire rather than participant in any impropriety. But the journal existed. Copies made by investigators before Philippe could confiscate the original began circulating quietly through Baton Rouge and New Orleans. The official investigation that followed became a masterclass in antebellum damage control. Louisiana's elite had a vested interest in suppressing the truth, and they exercised their power ruthlessly. Parish coroner Dr. H.N. Marin, a plantation owner and social acquaintance of the Bowmonts, issued his findings within 48 hours. Marguerite's death was ruled a suicide while of unsound mind. Samuel's death was deemed accidental, the result of attempting to rescue his mistress from the flames. The report omitted any mention of an affair, ignored the journal entirely, and avoided all language suggesting impropriety. Several members of the original investigating team refused to sign off on conclusions. Sheriff's Deputy Thomas Whitmore, a transplant from Massachusetts with fewer ties to Southern social codes, filed a dissenting report. He noted the chains in the barn, the bar door, and the evidence of long-term preparation. He questioned why a field slave would risk his life for a woman he supposedly barely knew, and why the door had been locked from the inside. Whitmore's report was buried in court records and would not resurface for more than a century. Governor Bowmont moved quickly. Within a week, he sold Bel'Ombre to a buyer from Texas and announced his retirement from public life, citing grief and family obligations. He never again sought office, though he retained his wealth and social standing. Marguerite's family proved equally eager to erase the truth. They attributed her death to brain fever, a diagnosis vague enough to conceal anything from meningitis to mental illness. A memorial was commissioned in St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans. The epitaph was carefully worded to suggest Christian martyrdom rather than suicide. Samuel received no memorial. Plantation records listed his death as accidental. His body was buried without marker or ceremony in the slave cemetery at Bel'Ombre, yet the journal could not be fully destroyed. At least 3 complete transcriptions survived, preserved by individuals who understood their significance. One was copied by Reverend Marcus Delane, a Methodist minister with abolitionist sympathies, who had been called to Bel'Ombre after the fire. Shown the journal by a conflicted McCready, Delane made a careful copy and later smuggled it north. Abolitionist newspapers discussed its contents privately but refused to publish it, fearing legal retaliation. A second copy was preserved by McCready himself. After the Civil War, he attempted to publish his account, but publishers deemed it too scandalous. His manuscript remained hidden until 1979, when historians discovered it in an attic in Aberdeen, Mississippi. The third copy followed the most fragile path. Delia, Marguerite's maid, had hastily written down passages before the journal was seized. Her literacy was limited and the record incomplete, but even fragments proved impossible to silence. Time was short, but Delia recorded enough to preserve the affair's essential details. Her notes passed quietly through several generations of her descendants before being donated to Xavier University's archives in 1952, where they remain today as fragmentary but invaluable testimony. The legal proceedings that followed the deaths of Bel'Ombre were minimal and carefully choreographed. No criminal charges were ever filed. A private civil inquest, conducted at the family's request, concluded that all parties had acted appropriately under the circumstances. Philippe Beaumont was formally absolved of any responsibility. Both families successfully petitioned to have the official record sealed for 99 years, citing the need to protect innocent parties from scandal and gossip. For the enslaved community at Bel'Ombre, the aftermath was devastating. Beaumont sold most of the enslaved people immediately, shattering families and social networks that had existed for decades. A small number, including Jacob and Delia, were retained by the new owner, though under harsher conditions than those they had known before. Moses, the field hand who had first reported seeing Marguerite and Samuel together, vanished entirely from plantation records. Some later accounts suggest he was sold deep into the lower South, to an owner notorious for brutality. Beaumont's final act of retribution against the man who exposed the scandal. Ruth, the house servant who had discovered the journal, suffered a similar fate. She was sold off the plantation within days of the fire. The tobacco barn itself was demolished immediately. Its charred remains were plowed under and planted with cotton. Within months, nothing visible marked the place where 2 people had died for a love their world could not tolerate. Philippe Beaumont remarried 3 years later, choosing a much older widow from a respectable but politically insignificant family. He lived until 1869, dying at the age of 62 from complications of pneumonia. His obituaries praised his public service and business acumen and made no mention of scandal. The Bowmont name, though quietly tarnished among those who knew the truth, endured. His children from his second marriage achieved modest success, and the event of his first marriage faded into rumor rather than record. But the story did not disappear. Among abolitionist circles, enslaved communities, and those who had witnessed or heard of the events at Bel-Ombre, the narrative persisted. It was retold in fragments, reshaped by memory, but its essential truth remained. A woman of privilege loved a man her society defined as property, and both chose death rather than separation. The Beaumont scandal, though suppressed in its time, exposed deep fractures in the antebellum South's carefully constructed social order. It challenged assumptions about race, gender, class, and power that underpinned slavery itself. For the planter class, Marguerite's transgression represented a profound threat. If a woman of elite education and breeding could recognize the humanity of an enslaved man deeply enough to love him and to die rather than surrender him, then the ideological foundations of slavery were dangerously unstable. This explains the ferocity with which the truth was buried. The danger lay not merely in the affair, but in what it revealed. That enslaved people were not the subhuman caricatures required by the system, but individuals capable of inspiring profound attachment in those who truly saw them. Abolitionists quickly recognized the story's power once smuggled accounts began circulating. Here was evidence that slavery corrupted not only the enslaved but the enslavers, warping human relationships and forcing impossible choices. Reverend Marcus Delane wrote privately, "The Beaumont affair demonstrates that slavery murders love itself, compelling even the most passionate hearts to choose between life and connection." Philippe Beaumont was formally absolved of any responsibility. Both families successfully petitioned to have the official record sealed for 99 years, citing the need to protect innocent parties from scandal and gossip. For the enslaved community at Bel-Ombre, the aftermath was devastating. Beaumont sold most of the enslaved people immediately, shattering families and social networks that had existed for decades. A small number, including Jacob and Delia, were retained by the new owner, though under harsher conditions than those they had known before. Moses, the field hand who had first reported seeing Marguerite and Samuel together, vanished entirely from plantation records. Some later accounts suggest he was sold deep into the lower South to an owner notorious for brutality. Beaumont's final act of retribution against a man who exposed a scandal. Ruth, the house servant who had discovered the journal, suffered a similar fate. She was sold off the plantation within days of the fire. The tobacco barn itself was demolished immediately. Its charred remains were plowed under and planted with cotton. Within months, nothing visible marked the place where two people had died for a love their world could not tolerate. Philippe Beaumont remarried 3 years later, choosing a much older widow from a respectable but politically insignificant family. He lived until 1869, dying at the age of 62 from complications of pneumonia. His obituaries praised his public service and business acumen and made no mention of scandal. The Bowmont name, though quietly tarnished among those who knew the truth, endured. His children from his second marriage achieved modest success, and the event of his first marriage faded into rumor rather than record. But the story did not disappear. Among abolitionist circles, enslaved communities, and those who had witnessed or heard of the events at Bel-Ombre, the narrative persisted. It was retold in fragments, reshaped by memory, but its essential truth remained. A woman of privilege loved a man her society defined as property, and both chose death rather than separation. The Beaumont scandal, though suppressed in its time, exposed deep fractures in the antebellum South's carefully constructed social order. It challenged assumptions about race, gender, class, and power that underpinned slavery itself. For the planter class, Marguerite's transgression represented a profound threat. If a woman of elite education and breeding could recognize the humanity of an enslaved man deeply enough to love him and to die rather than surrender him, then the ideological foundations of slavery were dangerously unstable. This explains the ferocity with which the truth was buried. The danger lay not merely in the affair, but in what it revealed. That enslaved people were not the subhuman caricatures required by the system, but individuals capable of inspiring profound attachment in those who truly saw them. Abolitionists quickly recognized the story's power once smuggled accounts began circulating. Here was evidence that slavery corrupted not only the enslaved but the enslavers, warping human relationships and forcing impossible choices. Reverend Marcus Delane wrote privately, "The Beaumont affair demonstrates that slavery murders love itself, compelling even the most passionate hearts to choose between life and connection.